Ancient philosophers said Eros, the god of love, created the world. Modern psychology quietly agrees, but calls it by a different name: libido. What if the same force that once powered reproduction now fuels your art, your hunger for meaning, your faith, and your insanity, all at once? Today, we'll trace how libido evolved from raw sexual drive into the world soul that shapes your reality from the inside out. Freud's main discussion of the analytic concept of libido is found in his work, Three Contributions to the Sexual Theory. There, he uses the word libido in a narrow sense. It means sexual drive, sexual impulse, sexual need. Clinical experience, however, quickly showed that this sexual energy can move and be displaced. Non-sexual functions and seemingly neutral areas of life can clearly absorb a certain amount of this libidinal force. In other words, activities or objects that outwardly have nothing to do with sexuality can take on a distinct sexual or erotic value. To explain this, Freud compares libido to a stream. It can be divided and channeled, it can be dammed up, it can overflow into side branches, and it can change its course. The flow of libido is not fixed in one place. It is important to understand that Freud's original view does not claim that everything is sexual, as some critics have suggested. Instead, he assumes that there are several basic forces in the psyche whose exact nature we still do not fully understand. One of these forces is the sexual drive. Based on obvious and widely observable facts, Freud concludes that these other forces can receive inflows of libido. He imagines the psyche as a bundle of impulses in which sexuality appears as one partial drive among several. This sexual drive can cross over into other domains, mixing with and intensifying non-sexual impulses. This overlap and encroachment are not speculative. They can be seen in everyday experience. From this image, Freud developed his theory of neurosis. The driving forces behind neurotic symptoms, he argues, correspond to the libidinal additions that have attached themselves to other, originally non-sexual functions. In my view, the work of Freud and his school has thoroughly confirmed this idea. Since the appearance of Three Contributions in 1905, the concept of libido has gradually changed and expanded. Its field of application has widened, and this present work is a clear example of that extension. Both Freud and I have felt the need to broaden the idea of libido beyond its first narrow limits. It was especially the study of paranoia, so closely related to dementia praecox, that pushed Freud to enlarge his earlier conception. In this context, he raises a crucial question. Is the mere withdrawal of libido from the outer world sufficient to explain the patient's feeling that the world has come to an end? Or should the ego's deeply rooted sense of reality be strong enough to preserve some connection with the outside world? If not, then we must consider two possibilities. Either what we call the possession of libido, that is, interest that springs from erotic sources, almost completely overlaps with interest in general, or profound disturbances in the distribution of libido also cause a corresponding disturbance in the strength and coherence of the ego. On these questions we are, as yet, far from having final answers. Here we reach the limits of our present knowledge. Things would be different if we could start from a solid, well-established understanding of instinct. But the truth is that we possess no such secure foundation. For the time being, we can only grasp instinct as the result of an interaction between the bodily and the psychic, rather than as something fully known and defined. We can think of the psyche as giving us an inner image of our basic organic forces. In simple terms, we usually separate the I impulse from the sexual impulse. This mirrors the biological double role of every individual. On the one hand, they fight to preserve their own life. On the other, they are driven to preserve the species. But beyond this basic distinction, everything else we build is essentially a model, a scaffold we construct and are willing to tear down again, just to orient ourselves in the confusing darkness of the soul's processes. We hope that psychoanalytic study of mental illness will eventually force us to make clearer decisions about how instincts really work. So far, that hope hasn't been fulfilled. Our investigations into these areas are still too young and too limited. Right now, we cannot yet clearly show how a disturbance in libido affects the ego's sense of possession and stability, nor can we fully prove the reverse. How abnormal changes in the ego might secondarily disturb the flow of libido. It is likely that these mutual disturbances between ego and libido are exactly what mark off the psychoses, the severe mental illnesses, from other conditions. But when we look more closely at paranoia, the conclusions are still uncertain. We cannot simply claim that a paranoid patient has completely withdrawn their interest from the external world, or that they have vanished entirely into the heights of repression, as we sometimes see in other forms of hallucinatory psychosis. The paranoid person still perceives the outer world. They track its changes, react to them, and feel compelled to explain what is happening around them. For this reason, it seems highly probable that their changed relationship to reality is fully, or in large part, due to a lack or deficiency in libido investment in the world. Here, Freud directly approaches a crucial question. Is the well-known craving for reality seen in paranoid dementia and in dementia praecox patients, which I discuss at length in my book, The Psychology of Dementia Praecox, simply the result of withdrawing libidinal energy from the world? Or does this withdrawal go hand in hand with a loss of so-called objective interest in general? It is unlikely that our normal sense of reality, what Janet called the fonction du réel, is maintained solely by erotic or libidinal currents. Clinical facts show that in many severe cases, reality disappears almost entirely. We see people in whom no trace of psychological adaptation or orientation to the real world can be recognized. In such states, reality is pushed away and repressed. In its place, the contents of an inner complex take over. In these situations, we must say that not only erotic interest, but interest as a whole has vanished. The person's entire adaptation to reality has collapsed. It is into this group that we must place the stuporous patients and the catatonic automatons, those who sit motionless, silent, and seemingly unreachable, their outer life extinguished while their inner complex rules in the background. I used the phrase psychic energy in my earlier video for a reason. At that time, I couldn't yet ground my understanding of this psychosis in Freud's idea of displaced flows of libido. My experience was mostly psychiatric, and I simply didn't have the analytical background to grasp that theory fully. Later, as I worked more deeply with cases of hysteria and obsessive-compulsive neuroses, I became convinced that Freud's libido theory is essentially correct for the neuroses, especially the so-called transference neuroses. There, the key question is this: does the portion of libido that's held back by repression turn inward and regress into earlier forms of attachment, such as the old, deeply rooted parental transference? When that happens, something important remains intact. The person's non-sexual psychological adaptation to everyday life largely stays in place, except in those areas directly affected by erotic conflicts and the symptoms that grow out of them. In neurosis, the missing reality for the patient is precisely that part of the libido which has been withdrawn into the symptoms. In dementia praecox, however, the situation is very different. It is not only the part of libido affected by specific sexual repression that is withdrawn from reality, but far more than we can reasonably attribute to sexuality in the narrow sense. The person's relationship to reality is disturbed to such a degree that even their basic drive to act, to engage with life, seems to be drained away. To call this loss purely sexual does not seem accurate. Our ordinary sense of reality testing is not normally understood as a sexual function, and if it truly were, then a strict introversion of sexual libido in the neuroses should lead to a collapse of reality comparable to what we see in dementia praecox, which it does not. Because of this, I found it impossible to apply Freud's libido theory in its original sexual definition, directly to dementia praecox. For the same reason, I believe Abraham's attempt to explain paranoid or schizophrenic symptoms simply by withdrawal of libido from the outer world is not theoretically justified. A mere introversion and regression of libido, as Freud clearly demonstrated, leads into the neuroses, specifically into the transference neuroses, and not into dementia praecox. The loss of reality in dementia praecox is of another order and cannot be explained by a deficit of libido understood only as sexual energy. It is a particular satisfaction to me that our teacher himself, when he turned to the subtle and fragile material of paranoid psychology, also began to question whether his then current concept of libido was sufficient. Its purely sexual definition did not allow me to make sense of functional disturbances that affect the hunger instinct just as much as the sexual instinct. For a long time, this made Freud's libido theory seem unusable to me in understanding dementia praecox. But as my experience and analytical work grew, my idea of libido slowly changed. The descriptive definition from the three contributions gave way, in my mind, to a broader, more general definition. This shift allowed me to replace the vague phrase psychic energy with the more precise, though now expanded, concept of libido. I had to ask myself, does the function of reality today really consist only in a small part of sexual libido and in a larger part of other drives? Or is it possible that, in the long sweep of human evolution, the function of reality itself is, to a great extent, rooted in processes that were originally sexual? We cannot answer this question directly by looking at the function of reality as it presents itself now. But we can try to approach it indirectly, step by step, and see what light this broader concept of libido can shed on dementia praecox and on our relation to reality as a whole. Take a quick look at the story of evolution and you'll notice something striking. Many complex functions that today seem to have nothing to do with sex actually grew out of one basic root: the drive to reproduce. As life climbed the ladder of the animal kingdom, the strategy of reproduction changed. Instead of producing huge quantities of eggs and sperm with uncertain chances of fertilization, nature gradually shifted toward more controlled fertilization and better protection of the young. Part of the energy that once went into sheer mass of reproductive cells was redirected into something else, into displays that attract mates and into behaviors that guard offspring. Here, in those early displays and protective rituals, we can already glimpse the first instincts of art in animals. Colors, songs, dances, all in the service of creation and appearing only during the breeding season. Over time, these patterns became fixed in the organism. They hardened into stable traits and functions. Their original sexual meaning faded from view, and they started to live their own independent life. We see something similar in human culture. Even if we accept that music may have a deeply sexual origin, it would be a crude and unimaginative simplification to reduce all music to sexuality. That would be like calling the Cologne Cathedral a chapter of mineralogy simply because it is built of stone. For anyone unfamiliar with evolutionary thought, it can be shocking to realize how few elements of human life cannot, in the last analysis, be traced back to the instinct of procreation. Almost everything we hold dear, everything we love and cling to, is, in some transformed way, rooted in that original creative impulse. Earlier, we spoke of libido as this creative impulse. At the same time, there is an old tradition that contrasts libido with hunger, the instinct to preserve the species versus the instinct to preserve the individual. In nature, however, this sharp division does not really exist. What we see instead is one continuous life force, a will to live, that maintains the individual precisely so that the species can be created and sustained. In this sense, the idea of libido begins to line up with Schopenhauer's notion of the will. We can only grasp the will as the outward expression of an inner striving, an inner desire. When we project these psychological experiences outward and treat them as properties of the world itself, philosophers call this introjection. Ferenczi used the word introjection in almost the opposite way, to mean taking the outside world into the inner world. But in the sense I am using it here, introjection means that our view of the world is always somewhat distorted because we throw our inner experiences onto outer reality. Freud's pleasure principle can be seen as one deliberate way of describing this mechanism of introjection. The world is organized in our minds around our desire for pleasure. His contrasting reality principle then plays the same role as what I call the corrective of reality, and what the philosopher Richard Avenarius described as the empirio-critical principle of coordination. That is, the way reality pushes back and forces us to adjust our inner demands. Even our idea of power is born from introjection. Galileo already hinted at this when he said that the concept of force comes from our own subjective experience of muscular effort. We feel our strength, and then we project that feeling outward and call it power in the world. We have already taken a bold step in assuming that libido, which once served almost exclusively to produce eggs and sperm, can later become so firmly bound to a new function, like nest building, that it is no longer available for anything else. Once that energy is organized into a pattern, it is locked in. If that is true, then we are compelled to go even further. We must relate libido to every form of desire, including hunger. At that point, we can no longer honestly separate the will to build a nest from the will to eat. Both arise from the same underlying current of life. Seen this way, libido becomes something larger than a concept in biology. It shades into a philosophical idea, a general will. This is a kind of psychological voluntarism, a view that puts willing, striving energy at the very center. I leave it to the philosophers to decide how far they wish to carry this idea, and I simply point back to Schopenhauer's own reflections on the will. From a psychological point of view, this brings to mind the old cosmogenic meaning of Eros in Plato and Hesiod. In their vision, love is not merely a human feeling, it is a world-creating force. We see the same theme in the Orphic figure of Phanes, the shining one, the firstborn, the father of Eros. In the Orphic tradition, Phanes has something of the character of Priapus, a god of love, and he is also related to the Theban Dionysus Lysios, the liberator. In Indian thought, we find an echo of this in Kama, the god of love, who is at the same time a cosmogenic principle, the force that brings the world into being. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, takes this further into a philosophical system. For him, the world soul is the active energy of the intellect. He compares the one, the primal creative principle, to light itself, the intellect to the sun, and the world soul to the moon. In another image, he calls the one the Father, the intellect the Son, and the world soul subordinate to them. For Plotinus, the one, also named Uranus, is transcendent, beyond direct grasp. The Sun, as Kronos, rules over the visible world. The world soul, figured as Zeus, stands beneath him in the hierarchy. Plotinus calls the One, or the essence of all existence, hypostatic, and speaks of it as a single essence in three hypostases, mia ousia and trisin upostasisin. As the scholar Drews has pointed out, this formula closely parallels the later Christian doctrine of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, as it was defined at the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. Some early Christian groups even went so far as to interpret one aspect of this triadic pattern in maternal terms, seeing within the divine structure not only fatherhood and sonship, but also a kind of hidden motherhood at work in creation. According to the ancient philosophers, what Christianity later called the Holy Ghost can be compared to the world soul, sometimes even symbolized by the moon. Plotinus, for example, describes the world soul as something that tends toward division and multiplicity. This tendency toward being spread out and divided is the very condition that makes change, creation, and procreation possible. In that sense, the world soul has a distinctly maternal quality. He calls it an unending all of life, pure energy. It is like a living organism made of ideas, and within it, those ideas become active and real. The intellect is their source and father. It conceives the world soul and brings it to development through thought. What is contained in pure intellect unfolds in the world soul as logos, as living meaning. This logos fills the soul, saturates it with significance, and makes it feel as though it were intoxicated with nectar. This image of nectar is not accidental. It parallels the ancient drink soma, the drink of life and fertility, and is also comparable to seed or sperma. The soul is fertilized by the intellect. As a great, overarching soul, it is called the heavenly Aphrodite. As the soul rooted in the material and bodily, it appears as the earthly Aphrodite. This soul knows the birth pangs, it participates in creation and suffering. And it is no coincidence that the dove, the bird of Aphrodite, later becomes one of the central symbols of the Holy Ghost. Even this small fragment from the history of philosophy shows how important our inner experience of libido is, and how deeply its symbolism has shaped human thought. If we look at nature, we can see this same libido, or life desire, expressing itself in countless different forms. In early childhood, libido is directed almost entirely toward nourishment. The child's energy serves first and foremost to build up the body. As the body grows, new fields of activity slowly open up for the libido. The last and most powerful of these is sexuality. At first, it is still closely connected to nourishment, just as in lower animals and plants, where the ability to reproduce is strongly influenced by conditions of nutrition. In the realm of sexuality, libido takes on the form that has led us to use the term for psychic energy in general. Here it appears clearly as the impulse toward procreation, an almost undifferentiated primal sexual energy, a pure force of growth that drives the individual toward division, budding, and reproduction. We see the sharpest distinction between the nutritive form of libido and the sexual form in those animals whose feeding stage is separated from their sexual stage by a chrysalis phase. From this primal sexual libido, which once enabled a tiny organism to produce millions of eggs or seeds, there gradually develop more specialized, limited forms. Fecundity becomes restricted, and certain functions are now sustained by a particular differentiated libido. This differentiated libido is, in a sense, desexualized. It has been separated from its original task of producing eggs and seed, and it can no longer simply return to that primitive function. Overall, development consists of an increasing transformation of the primal reproductive libido into secondary functions, such as attraction, care, and protection of the young. These new functions demand a far more complex relationship to reality. They require what we might call a genuine function of reality, tightly and inseparably linked to the needs of reproduction. When the mode of procreation changes in this way, it brings with it a corresponding increase in adaptation to the outer world. The psyche, guided by libido, does not just reproduce life, it learns to live in reality more effectively in order to protect and sustain that life. In this section, we're looking behind the scenes of how our basic sense of reality is powered. It would be a mistake to say that this power is purely sexual, but we can't deny that sexuality plays a major role. Think of the original life energy, the primal libido, as a raw force. Over time, parts of this force are diverted from their original sexual aim and gradually transformed into other drives. A significant portion is redirected into behaviors that attract a partner and protect the young. This reshaping of sexual energy into new purposes is still happening in us today. When this redirection of libido works well and doesn't damage a person's ability to adapt to life, we call it sublimation. When it does not work, when the energy cannot find a new healthy outlet, we see repression instead. Traditional, descriptive psychology usually treats our drives as many separate instincts. Sexual instinct is just one among them, and it's simply noted that some of its energy can flow into non-sexual instincts. The genetic point of view, however, tells a different story. It sees all these different instincts as branches from one original root, the primal libido. Portions of this original energy are split off, tied to new functions, and eventually merged with them so completely that they appear as separate drives. Because of this, from the genetic standpoint, we can't cling to a narrow, purely sexual idea of libido. We are forced to broaden the concept. This is the understanding of libido that I quietly wove into the first part of this work, only now revealing my intent. This broader genetic idea of libido, one that goes beyond the merely sexual, made it possible to extend Freud's libido theory into the psychology of mental illness. Freud's current, more strictly sexual conception runs into serious problems when it tries to explain psychoses. So, when I speak of libido, I mean this wider concept. It includes not only clearly sexual energy, but also a portion of desexualized primal libido. When I say that a sick person withdraws libido from the outer world to invest it in an inner world, I do not mean they withdraw only the emotional charge from daily reality. I mean they pull back energy from those desexualized instincts which normally sustain and support our sense of reality. If we shift our concept of libido in this way, our terminology must also change. For example, Abraham tried to apply Freud's libido theory to dementia praecox and described the patient's loss of contact with reality as autoerotism. This works for hysteria. When hysterical patients turn their libido inward, it is mostly erotic energy that was meant to help them adapt to reality. That energy is now turned back toward the ego, which becomes flooded with erotic libido. In that sense, autoerotism is a fitting description, but schizophrenic patients turn away from reality much more radically than this would suggest. Their inner state is not simply autoerotic. They build an entire inner psychic substitute for the outer world. To do this, they must draw on more than just erotic energy. They need the deeper, desexualized forces that once upheld reality itself. For this reason, I agree with Bleuler in rejecting the term autoerotism, a concept derived from the study of hysterical neuroses, and in replacing it with autism, autismus. Autism is a better description of what we see, a turning away from reality and the construction of an inward, self-contained world. I therefore withdraw my earlier claim that Bleuler's autism and Freud's autoerotism are essentially the same. A thorough revision of the libido concept has shown me that this identification was not justified. It is precisely this deeper, more comprehensive view of libido that forces us to refine our language and sharpen our understanding of how the psyche withdraws from or remains engaged with reality. From these considerations, it becomes clear that we must give up a purely descriptive, psychological notion of libido. If we want to apply the libido theory to dementia praecox, Freud's brilliant analysis of Schreber's fantasies shows how powerful and appropriate this application can be. The next question is whether the genetic conception of libido that I propose can also be used to understand the neuroses. I believe it can. Nature does not make leaps. It is not only possible but highly probable that in the neuroses we encounter temporary functional disturbances, sometimes quite profound, that extend beyond the strictly sexual sphere. We see such disturbances even more clearly in psychotic episodes. The broadening of the concept of libido that has emerged from recent analytic work is, in my view, a genuine advance. It will be especially useful in the important field of introversion psychoses. Evidence supporting this is already available. A series of studies from the Zurich School, now partly published, has shown that the fantastic substitute creations which appear when the function of reality is disturbed bear unmistakable traces of archaic thinking. This observation fits perfectly with the earlier idea that what is withdrawn from reality is not only an immediate individual amount of libido, but also a portion that has already been differentiated and desexualized. In normal people, this portion has supported the function of reality since prehistoric times. When this most recent achievement of adaptation drops away, It must of necessity be replaced by an earlier mode of adaptation. We already encounter this principle in the theory of the neuroses. When a new transference fails, repression forces the libido back into an older form of transference, typically through a regressive revival of the parental imago. In the transference neurosis, such as hysteria, only a part of the immediate sexual libido is withdrawn from reality by specific sexual repression. The resulting substitute is then a fantasy of individual origin and meaning, showing only slight hints of those archaic characteristics that are so evident in the fantasies of more severe mental disorders. In such disorders, a portion of the general human function of reality, organized since ancient times, has broken away and can only be replaced by a universally valid archaic surrogate. Honegger has provided a simple and vivid example of this. A paranoid patient of good intelligence who fully understands the modern astronomical view of a spherical Earth rotating around the Sun abandons this view and builds up an elaborate personal system. In this system, the Earth is a flat disk over which the Sun travels. This is clearly an archaic conception. It calls to mind the sun phallus motif mentioned earlier, which we also owe to Honegger's investigations. Spielrein has likewise presented striking examples of how archaic meanings can overlay modern words in certain illnesses. One of her patients correctly uncovered the mythological meaning of alcohol, the intoxicating drink, as an effusion of seed. The same patient developed a symbolism of boiling that closely parallels the important alchemical vision of Zosimos, who saw people boiling in water within the cavity of an altar. This patient also used earth and water as symbolic expressions for mother. I will not multiply examples here, since future work from the Zurich School will undoubtedly supply abundant further evidence of this kind. The idea I'm working with is that when a person's sense of reality is disturbed, the mind often replaces it with something archaic, an older, symbolic stand-in. Sabina Spielrein expresses this with a striking paradox. At times, she says, it feels as if such patients are merely victims of an old folk superstition. In other words, instead of living in the present world, they slip into fantasies that resemble outdated beliefs from the past, beliefs that were once taken as literal descriptions of reality. The vision of Zosimos shows us how these old superstitions actually functioned as symbols. They were not just errors, they were bridges, tools that allowed people to cross into very distant inner territories of experience. In certain archaic periods, this was extremely useful because it gave the psyche an easy way to divert a portion of the life energy, the libido, away from crude instinct and into the mental and spiritual realm. Spielrein seems to have a similar biological understanding of symbols when she writes that a symbol arises from the tendency of a complex to dissolve into the general stream of thought. In that process, the complex loses some of its intensely personal character. This drive toward dissolving or transforming each individual complex, she says, is what fuels poetry, painting, and every form of art. If we translate her more formal term, complex, into the language of libido, if we treat it as a certain quantity of psychic energy, her view aligns very well with mine. Imagine a primitive person who clearly understands what sexual generation is. Following the path of least resistance, he would never spontaneously come up with the idea that a sword blade or a weaving shuttle could take the place of the sexual organs. Yet, there are Indian myths that explain the origin of humankind precisely through the union of such substitute symbols. Something must have pushed the mind to invent these analogies, so that obvious sexual interest could be displaced onto an apparently non-sexual image. In my view, the driving force behind this shift, from direct sexual libido to a non-sexual representation, can only be a resistance to primitive sexuality itself. The psyche avoids the raw form of the drive, and so it looks for indirect, symbolic roots. Through this continual creation of fantastic analogies, more and more libido becomes desexualized over time, because more and more symbolic images take the place of primitive sexual expression. At the same time, the human picture of the world expands enormously, since new objects are constantly being drawn in and used as sexual symbols. It is quite possible that human consciousness, at least in large part, reached its present level by exactly this route. In any case, the urge to discover analogies is clearly of great importance for the development of the human mind. Steinthal is right to say that the tiny phrase, even just like, plays an almost overwhelming role in the history of thought. One can easily imagine that by carrying libido over into these fantastic equivalents, early humans were led to some of their most important discoveries.